Okay. Good afternoon, and I hope everybody is refreshed from lunch. I was very glad to notice in the program, especially after the last presentation, that there was lunch, because the very idea of following you and the general, I thought, okay, there's a rule here. Captains don't follow generals, and I thought civilians don't follow captains or generals. This is a really bad idea. So lunch was a really good idea, and I very much appreciate it. The two things that you're going to hear me talk about the most are first summarized by what has become the American Historical Association's tagline. Everything has a history. And I'm going to keep coming back to that. Everything has a history. And the second thing I'm going to talk about on and off is historical thinking. So first, a few disclaimers. One is I thought I was supposed to talk without notes. Then I found out I was allowed notes. So I had some notes. And those notes were typed out really, those of you who can see, those notes were typed out really neatly. And then I was listening to these brilliant presentations in the morning, and now this is what those notes look like, which is very difficult to decipher. The other thing is I was struck this morning when we started off, I think it was Professor Utz talked about how technology can empower, but also there can be issues. And I've had trouble with HR people about this. I have always had, and I've done it once, I have to say, I've always had a fantasy about interviewing people for jobs that require an ability to think quickly on your feet and an ability to sort of have a presence. And in that fantasized job interview, there's technology, and you make sure it doesn't work. And then you see, how do they deal with this? And you can learn universities, that's an essential skill, is to be able to still teach when the technology doesn't work. So here it seems to work. I used to be at a university where at 4 o'clock every day, 4:15 every day, the radiators clanged really loud. And in the room where there were job interviews, job talks. And so that was part of the test, was how does somebody deal with, they're basically in the third paragraph of their paper, and suddenly the radiators really loud, and how do they deal with this? This was part of, what kind of teaching presence this person have. So I appreciate the fact that it won't be a problem here. The second thing I want to respond to, which I heard this morning, is that the humanities is more important than ever. I don't think that's true. And if you don't believe me, read the Constitution of the United States. The humanities have always been essential. If the founders had not had the education, the preparation in the humanities, even though it was not called that they had, that document would not look like what it was. And you can see that from Madison's journals. You can see that from all the notes that are taken in the Constitutional Convention. So I think that there's a way in which we want to argue this for rhetorical reasons, but I actually don't think this is true. I think that, in fact, what we now call humanistic disciplines have been absolutely essential since the days of Socrates, if not before. Second is when we talk about the imperative of historical thinking, I want to remind everybody where we are. We're in a building whose name includes history, but we are also in a building that relates to a discipline that people don't think of as requiring history courses, historical knowledge, but think about it. And this goes back to not knowing history, but historical thinking. What does every medical professional do when they meet a patient? They take a history. So what does that mean? If that medical professional thinks that taking a history means names, dates, facts, what people think is history, then they're going to ask certain questions. Now, imagine if that medical professional understands what we, professional historians, consider to be historical thinking, which is very different from names, dates, and facts, and I'll get into this a little bit later. If that medical professional understands what historical thinking is, they're going to ask a whole different set of questions, because historical thinking has at its center at least 4 concepts. If I say only 4, then someone's going to jump up and say, what about this and this? But change over time, context, diversity of experience, and I say of experience because I don't want you to think I'm just talking about diversity in the way we usually talk about it, but diversity of experience, and historical empathy. Those are 4 of the concepts that lie at the center of historical thinking. So imagine the difference between the doctor who takes a history by finding out basically all the facts, and the doctor who has those 4 concepts at the center of their mind. It's a completely different way of learning about and understanding your patient. So, and then I also want to emphasize, because of this, the importance of remembering that everything has a history. This story may be apocryphal, but I don't think it is. It comes from someone who I believe was in the room at the time, about how STEM was invented. If you go back 50 years, you won't see any references to STEM. But apparently, again, this may be apocryphal, apparently there was a meeting, people were talking about the importance of education in these kinds of disciplines. And they talked about, well, yeah, there's science and mathematics and engineering and technology. And we need to emphasize science, mathematics, engineering, and technology. And that's how it started. And then a light bulb went off in someone's head and said, SMET. And so it became STEM. So everything has a history, even when it's somewhat meaningless. But what I do want to emphasize is that sometimes it's meaningful. So the American Historical Association does a series of congressional briefings. And you heard a lot this morning about what the Public Policy School does and how important it is to train students in thinking about all of the important issues in public policy. Sure. So we do these congressional briefings for congressional staff. And as I'm sure the Sam Nunn students are very well prepared, the school students and all public policy students are well prepared. So what do we find out when we do a briefing on Korea for congressional staff? We find out that a large proportion of congressional staff don't know who we were fighting in the Korean War. What do we do when we do a congressional briefing on immigration? And we find out that a large proportion of congressional staff have no idea the door was closed for 40 years. And even those who do have no idea why that matters. And very few congressional staff know what happened in 1965, Hart-Celler Act, which completely changed the rules and completely changed the landscape. And these are people who are advising our members of Congress on immigration. We find out that large proportions of congressional staff, and I won't even talk about members, large proportion of congressional staff have no idea how the Social Security Act was crafted, what compromises were essential to get the Social Security Act through a Congress dominated by Southern Committee chairmen. Well, how do you sit in Congress? How do you advise your member, or in Washington lingo, your boss? How do you advise your boss on thinking about changes to Social Security when you have no idea why it looks the way it does? It's possible, but this is a very serious problem. So part of what I want to argue here is that everything has a history, and if you don't understand that history, you then have a serious problem in thinking about public policy, public culture, and actually any decisions that you have to make. So that's kind of number one. Number two, when we think about that, so that's the knowing of history. Then if you think about why it matters, historical thinking. It's not something you think about. We heard this morning it's really important to humanize STEM because in liberal arts, and by the way, liberal arts includes science and mathematics. People forget that. And that's really important because the people who most forget that liberal arts include science and mathematics tend to be the humanists. So no, folks, actually liberal education means they take some science over here and some mathematics over here. So when we think about humanities, liberal education, the first thing that comes to mind, as it did this morning, is critical thinking. And you have to have humanities courses for critical thinking. Well, that's just not true. My daughter majored in physics and astronomy in college. I can assure you she learned critical thinking. I'm really glad your daughter followed in what you do because I'm a historian of the United States and neither of my daughters took a single course on the history of the United States, so I really admire what you pulled off. So we all teach critical thinking. Every member of the faculty in this room teaches critical thinking within the context of their discipline. The difference is that each discipline has a way of thinking that is defined by their discipline. And we heard this morning about how disciplines are important. They are not legacy, they are not the equivalent of the legacy airlines. They actually are important. Norms matter. I was so happy to see norms up there on the screen and talking about why they matter because I live in Washington, 8 blocks from the Capitol. Believe me, norms matter. So each discipline has its own norms for evidence, for writing, and quite frankly, the quest for interdisciplinarity sometimes forgets that it's very, very, very hard to be interdisciplinary if you have not mastered a discipline. Because it's very hard to kind of do this unless you understand at least one of these before you start doing this. Multidisciplinarity is something else, as we learned this morning. And we didn't hear about cross-disciplinarity, which also is a way of thinking of different disciplines interacting to create new knowledge. So that's the first thing, is that this is not about critical thinking. This is about, for me, this is about historical thinking. And for someone here in literary studies, it's going to be about a different kind of thinking. Philosophy is going to be a different kind of thinking. Astronomy is going to be. But what's important for students is to have exposure to these different ways of thinking. Because when you make decisions, if you can pull down, we heard this morning about the Situation Room, right? If you have people in the Situation Room who have experience in historical thinking and thinking like scientists and thinking like math, then you're going to get a wide variety of perspectives. There are people who argue that the problem with the athletic department at Penn State when it had its disaster was that there was nobody in the room who thought differently from anybody else in the room. And so nobody asked the questions that needed to be asked, and quite frankly, there's an identity aspect of this which normally I'd be uneasy with, but I think in this case it was absolutely true. Some people have argued that if there had been a single woman in that room making decisions at the highest level of the athletic department, some of those things might at least have been questioned. So it's a matter of diversity in many cases, of experience, but also diversity of ideas, diversity of ways of thinking. So for me, it's about training students in historical thinking, but you want different disciplines. That difference in how we think also extends to evidence. So those of you who are engineers, you're accustomed to teaching your students, okay, if you want to demonstrate this is the kind of evidence I'm going to require. Lawyers, this is the kind of evidence I'm going to require. Historians require evidence that's very different from lawyers, philosophers, engineers. I'm going to be followed on this stage by a literary scholar. Literary scholars have very different rules of evidence from historians. Not that theirs are wrong and ours are right, but it's different assumptions within a discipline about what constitutes evidence to demonstrate an argument. For a historian, we are a little more comfortable, for example, with uncertainty than some of the faculty members in this audience. But we are probably less comfortable with uncertainty than some other humanistic disciplines. What do we look for? We look for what we call the most compelling narrative. How do you decide the most compelling narrative? Well, that has to do with certain rules of evidence that historians use, norms of the discipline, that we then say, okay, this is what we think happened. Sometimes the evidence is going to lead 4 different historians who are thoughtful, capable, skilled historians coming up with 4 different narratives. One of the things we do with students is we say, okay, these are all 4 qualified historians using evidence the way we're supposed to use them. Look at these 4 different narratives or 4 different explanations, and let's talk about what makes the most sense to you. And sometimes what happens with students is they say, no, this one, let me tell you why this one doesn't make sense. Sometimes what you'll get is a student who's majoring in another discipline who will say, I'm a sociologist, and let me tell you why sociologists can make it very clear why that makes no sense. And that's part of where the interdisciplinarity comes in. But what I want to emphasize is that these different notions of what evidence is, different kinds of questions that we ask, are absolutely essential to an undergraduate education. And so for historians, it's historical questions and it's rules of empathy. So one of the things that I want to then go back to is what I said were these 4 centerpieces of historical thinking. Change, context, diversity of experience, and historical empathy. So what do I mean by each of those? First is change. All historians are trying to understand how things changed. It's one of the differences, I think, between history and some other social sciences. But our goal is to try to understand we were here. We were here, how did we get here? This is always useful because we too often look at where we are and don't think about, well, how did we get there? So historical change, what happens then is you develop models of historical change. And if you understand change, if you understand how we got from here to there, 2 things happen. One is you set aside the notion of inevitability. One of the big controversies right now in academic publishing, for example, is open access. And I'm not going to get into an argument, especially with scientists, over open access. But what I hear in many meetings is someone saying, this is what's going to happen. This is inevitable. This is what's coming. And my answer has always been, I'm sorry, I'm a historian. I don't believe it's inevitable. I believe in human agency. I believe in the ways in which we understand how structures affect other structures. And so, no, don't tell me it's going to happen. Let's talk about how we shape how it happens. Because that's what we study as historians, is how change happens and how there is human agency involved in change. The second reason it's important is what I was talking about, the example I gave with Social Security, which is it's very difficult to understand how something has become enmeshed in certain ways, whether it's Social Security, welfare, without understanding how that actually came to be. You can't untangle something unless you figure out, in a sense, how the knot took place. Second, context, which relates to change, obviously, which is the emphasis, again, when you're teaching with students, that everything happens in a context. You cannot understand anything unless you understand the context. Nothing, this is, and I'm not making a political statement here, I'm just dragging in one presidential candidate because it's a juicy quote. Kamala Harris's famous comment that actually was all over TikTok about the coconut. What was her mother doing there when she said this was not like just a coconut dropping from a tree? Her mother was talking about context. Her mother was a biologist. Actually, biologists study change too. And actually, biologists study context in a different way. But her mother was talking about context. That was not just a coconut that dropped out of a tree. There was a context to this. Well, this is what historians do, and this is what our students learn in their classes. Third, diversity of experience. How is it possible for us to think about how change happens? How is it possible for us to think about public policy unless we recognize the different experiences that we're dealing with on the ground? We heard about this with the water in Africa. I would argue there should have been a historian on that team. Well, I generally argue there should be a historian on every team. And that's not, a labor union thing about employment. And it's an intellectual thing. Why there should be a historian on every team, because everything has a history, and historical thinking is always useful. If there was a historian on that team, somebody would have said, how has this space been used in the past? Is there any sacred space that's involved in this little area here? There's a whole bunch of questions that a historian would have asked that has to do with how did that space evolve from what it once was to what it is now? And maybe that mistake wouldn't have been made. I think that when you expand this out to the humanities in general, you get even better questions, you get even more questions. The famous one is General Motors introducing in Spain the Chevy Nova. Yeah, those of you who speak Spanish know this. Nobody actually spoke up in a meeting at General Motors and said, this is not a good idea, Nova. Had there been a linguist, had there been a literary scholar, had there been anybody who knows Spanish in the room, they would not have tried to sell the Chevy Nova in Spain. So these kinds of what we call humanistic questions actually always matter. And then finally, historical empathy. And I want to talk about that because it's something people don't understand. I got myself in trouble recently. I was talking to an NEH Summer Institute. I will not talk about which discipline it was. It was not historians. And I was trying to explain the difference for when we study history, the difference between empathy and sympathy. That we tried to say to our students, do not try to sympathize with these people in the past. We realize that you're going to. It's a human, sort of a natural human emotion. I feel sorry for these people. I admire these people, whatever, whatever. History is not about feeling. It's not about how you feel. History is about understanding how other people feel. So when we talk about historical empathy, what we're trying to do, and this goes back to context, is situate ourselves in the space where somebody else lived and was making decisions. I got some pushback on this, and I said, okay, let me give you an example. How do you write a biography of Hitler or Stalin without what we're calling historical empathy? And the answer from, I would say, a quarter of the people in the room was, you shouldn't do that. And you especially shouldn't do that with students. That's a horrible idea. Students should not try to empathize with Stalin or Hitler. And our point was, no, when we say historical empathy, what we want our students to do is understand. We want our students to be able to sit back and say, how did that person become the policymaker that they became? That's what we mean by historical empathy. Not, we want you to try to sympathize with oppressed peoples. Not what we want you to sympathize with X, Y, or Z. We want you to understand anybody whom we are studying. And it is worthwhile to understand almost anybody out there because you are, in your life, going to come across these people. To go back again to Humanizing STEM, a university that is notable for its engineering school, probably a missions competitor to Georgia Tech, which will remain nameless, in another region. A historian was given license by the dean, license, time, and money, to try to rethink some aspects of the gen ed program. So instead of saying, okay, we humanists can do X, Y, or Z, and we're going to sell it to them, she actually she behaved, what I would argue is behaving like a historian, which is you start very humbly and ask questions. So she went to the dean of the engineering school. What do your students need? Not what can we provide. Someone this morning, might have been you, might have been Dina, but someone this morning was referring to gaps in the engineering curriculum. She said, what's your gap? What don't your students get? The dean of this particular engineering school said, well, actually, it was predominantly a male student population, said, they really don't know how to deal with women. And she said, we can help you with that. She went to the dean of the business school. Our students don't know how to interact with and work with people who have different values from theirs. She said, we can help you with that. So these are the kinds of gaps sometimes that exist, whether it's in STEM disciplines in business schools, that humanists can be helpful with. And literary scholars can do it in one way, in terms of having students immerse themselves in other ways of thinking, and historians do it in a different way. We do it through what we call historical empathy. Our argument is that a student in a history course is basically, quite frankly, learning a skill. When that student learns about, I don't care if it's St. Augustine, I don't care if it's the Meiji Emperor, or I don't care if it's Stalin, or I don't care if it's a French peasant. What I'm going to do is try to help our students understand how that person, how those people understood their world. And that's a skill. They may never remember the facts of it, but they will remember how they managed to learn how those people understood their world. So that is what I would try to argue is what we're providing as historians, and I think also to other humanities disciplines that I'm not going to try to talk about because I'm not expert in them. That's what I think we are providing to engineering students, to business students, to students in on what many humanists unfortunately refer to as the alien disciplines. It's the notion that we are here as college professors to help our students learn as many ways of thinking as possible. The dean of, I guess, Georgia Tech has it's a new school for lifetime learning, was asked, well, what are you doing here? And since I don't have extensive notes, I don't have the exact quote, but the closest I can say, he said something along the lines of, we are preparing the students for the future. We are preparing them to live in the future and to negotiate the future. And I think that's a great way to describe the two things that I would say describe liberal education are that quote and lifelong learning. Those things are related. And what lifelong learning means is basically helping students to understand that it's fun to read fiction. It's fun to read history. Everything has a history. If you're interested in golf, I'm going to tell you to go read golf history for the next 3 weeks so at least you can understand why it's fun to know about the past. So this is why we're here, is so that students can negotiate the future and that students for the rest of their life will want to learn, in my case, they'll want to learn history. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, in response to that insightful presentation, we now welcome Victoria Thompson, School Chair and Professor in the School of History and Sociology. Please join us in welcoming Victoria.
It's such a pleasure and honor to be here and an honor to follow Jim Grossman in his remarks. I think these are more emotional support notes at this point than anything I'm really going to refer to, because as Jim was saying, every talk today has made me think about different things, and I've been kind of scribbling along. So one of the first things that I was thinking about was the impact of a liberal arts education. And we've been talking a lot today about an impact in terms of how a liberal arts education prepares you to solve and participate in solving real world problems. But I want to just start with an anecdote that demonstrates it on a more personal level as well. In 1982, I was a senior at UC Berkeley. I was a history major, and I was enrolled in a course on modern French thought where we were reading Michel Foucault. And I went from that class where we had been reading about how in modern society, modern Western populations internalize the norms and rules and disciplines so that they basically discipline themselves. And I went to my after-school job, which was, of course, in a used bookstore, and punched the time clock. And as I punched the time clock, I thought, oh, Foucault was right. And it was at that moment where, I mean, my understanding of Foucault and how all that works became hopefully more sophisticated over time. But it was a moment where it really showed to me the connection between what I was learning, which seemed very esoteric, modern French thought, and my daily life. And that's one of the things that I think the School of History and Sociology does extremely well, which is help students understand the connection between whether it's histories of foreign countries or of people living long ago in the past, or whether it's the experiences of communities of which they are not a part and with which they might not normally interact, understanding how learning about those communities and those societies really sheds light not only into the world in which we live, but also into their own experience. So the School of History and Sociology is in some ways an accident of history. It emerged out of a program in science and technology studies, and was also charged with educating Georgia Tech students in the basics of US history, the basics of sociology. In the beginning, we had faculty from a lot of different disciplines, and over time it was focused on historians and sociologists, although we just hired an archaeologist and a philosopher, so who knows what will be in the future. But the thing that people have said to me, the School of History and Sociology, what is that all about? Like, how does that work? I think it works extremely well, and I think this motto encapsulates why it works so well. We provide students with that variety of perspectives that Jim was talking about, and we do it in an interdisciplinary manner. So what I mean by that is that, our faculty in our school are very well rooted and trained in their disciplines, and we have heated discussions in our faculty meetings about, well, this course must be included because it's important to sociologists, or this course must be included because it's important to historians. And that's fantastic, that's what you want. From the student perspective, what they do is they go from a course in, say, the history of medicine with faculty member John Tone, to a course in the sociology of medicine with faculty member Jennifer Singh, and they learn about, and then maybe a course with Sam Wan in the sociology of aging and her research on people in homes, healthcare facilities for the elderly, and they learn about medicine and the experience of those within the healthcare system from different perspectives. So from our faculty, they are getting exposed to these different disciplinary approaches to the same big problems, and that's allowing them to develop that mindset that Jim and others talked about, where you don't just see the dam, right? You see the land, you see the people, you see the history, you see the warlords, right? You see the whole picture, and you can better make informed decisions. So I want to talk specifically about 3 areas of focus within the school. And one thing that I think is quite remarkable about our school is that we do have a strong focus in science and technology studies, but we consider that in a very broad, through a very broad lens, and we also do much more than that. So when we're thinking about science and technology, we have scholars like Eric Schatzberg who work specifically on the history of technology. We have scholars, Jennifer Singh, John Tone, I've mentioned, who work specifically on the history of medicine. And we have scholars like Helen Curry, Bill Winders, Alan Hyde, who are working on environment and agriculture. So we played around with STEAM, but the arts already stole that A in that acronym. So we don't know exactly. We're working on what we're going to call it. But what is very, I think, important for students is that as they go from a class on the history of food science and food systems to a class on the sociology of the environment, they are thinking about technology and they're thinking about science from many different perspectives and in many different subject areas. We've had graduates who've gone on to work as policy analysts at the National Science Foundation. Our distinguished alumni for last year was an undergrad in our program who went on to get a PhD in epidemiology and now works at the Center for Disease Control. So we have students who are going into scientific fields and whose interest in those fields was sparked by the education they got in our school. Oh, there was actually a reason why I wanted to mention in particular Jennifer's recent documentary, Navigating Autism in Communities of Color. This grew out of research that Dr. Singh did on she's a sociologist, she did an ethnography on clinic providing medical care and support to children with autism. And from that project, she collaborated with a scholar in literature, media, and communication, John Thornton, to produce this documentary. And one of the things that came out of this project and that continues to be a part of this project is interaction with the community. I was fortunate enough to attend the world premiere of this documentary, which happened on Georgia Tech's campus. And the comments and discussions with parents who have children who are autistic, community members who have created different foundations to help children with autism, adults who only through working on this project realized that they might be on the spectrum as well. It was really a wonderfully empowering experience. And this is another thing I wanted to emphasize about the School of History and Sociology is that our faculty are very community embedded. We do a lot of work with people in different communities. And in doing that, we show our students that knowledge is not top down, right? We can sit up here and, lecture students. But what they really learn when historians and sociologists and others have a commitment to community-based scholarship is that we don't know what we don't know until we talk to the community. And they teach us and they help us to learn what it is what kind of stories we should be telling, and they help us figure out how to tell those stories, and hopefully, as with this documentary project, we give them a forum to tell their own stories. This, I think, was also an aspect of Alan Hyde's work on building resilience to climate change and natural disasters among young people. He uses the tool of mapping to help young people talk about their communities and where there are areas of particular vulnerability or how they might prepare for natural disasters. Well, just a few weeks ago, he came back from South Africa, where he did kind of a pilot of this program in South Africa. And one of the really interesting things he was talking about afterwards was that in the community there, what the kids really wanted to talk about was gang violence. and kind of the insecurity they felt. And so he quickly, shifted modes, as good teachers and researchers do, and helped them map that and think about solutions to that. So in the School of History and Sociology, we're providing students with these different perspectives on really important problems, and then we're modeling for them how to go out into the public and learn from these communities, learn from the public to make the world a better place. The other thing that's not in our school's name, but it is very much in our identity and our ethos that cuts across the faculty, is a commitment to social justice. Whether it's the exhibit that is currently just finishing up at the Women's History Museum in Washington, D.C., that Sherry Randolph co-curated, We Who Believe in Freedom, an exhibit about Black feminist thought leaders in Washington, D.C., or whether it's the work of one of our newest colleagues, Calvin Zimmerman, a sociologist who is studying racial disparities in disciplinary practices in schools. Sherry's going out and creating this exhibit with interactive components where people can really feel a part of their history. Calvin's going out and not only learning from the ethnographic research he does, but then working with school administrators and teachers to help them understand and think about how they might change the way they discipline their students. The education that I think students get in the School of History and Sociology and in Ivan Allen College more generally prepares them for such a wide variety of careers and gives them that wide variety of perspectives. And what I'm probably most proud about is that they are doing remarkable things to really try and make the world a better place. And there's no better legacy than that as a teacher. So thank you.